One morning, and it will be soon, when everyone wakes up as a writer, the age of universal deafness and incomprehension will have arrived. The late Franco-Czech novelist Milan Kundera was born in Brno, in the Czechia region of what was then Czechoslovakia, on the first day of April in 1929. By the 1970s, he had moved permanently to France, and a slew of his later novels, including such titles as Ignorance, Slowness, and Identity, were all penned in his adoptive language. Wonderful tales, often with single-word titles, that provided a contrast with his initial run of often more ornately titled Czech-language novels, books which truly capture the formal irony, tonal splendor, aesthetic invention, and philosophical clarity that for many years shaped the popular imagination from book readers in the West. For 60 years, Milan Kundera's novels have colored our perception of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, of Prague as a complex, beautiful, painful, even evil, but irresistible city, and of France as a bastion, a remove, a vantage. And for this young man in his early 20s, romance was in the books as well. It was an apprenticeship, as well as an aesthetic adventure that espoused irony as well as eroticism and much else. In fact, his books ushered in a new brand of romantic novels to the popular imagination, which effortlessly threaded existential insight and political discourse into a late 20th century version of the novel that felt lithesome and agile on the outside and deeply connected to the blood and marrow of human experience on the inside. All of this was done with an ironic distance, an attitude of blithe humor and tongue-in-cheekiness that belied the totalitarian origins of Kundera's biographical circumstances. But when we think about Kundera's work, after the distance of several years have elapsed, the first thing we remember is that romance, the pangs, one might say, of disprized love. Kundera's art fostered a nuanced, in fact, deeply heady understanding of how people lived and loved in the world that was communist Prague. It was an atmosphere of paranoia and play acting, of denunciation and political erasure. His novels portray lovers, sometimes married but often participating outside the bonds of matrimony, and how they occasionally break one another like toys, only to return some 20 years down the road, projecting the layering of mind and memory against an apocalyptic backdrop of authoritarian Marxism. His books make a plea for how our romantic partners are our mirrors, requiring us to look at ourselves in all our humorous or sublime nakedness and damaged vulnerability, with all our ample flaws on full display. Returning to his books, we get the aching sense that if Milan Kundera hadn't been born into a ravaged land of alternating authoritarianisms, there's no telling to what ends he might have used his absolutely indelible gifts. What great subject might he have written his way into had he not come of age in an atmosphere of backbiting and loyalty oaths, of ruined careers, pervasive distrust and denunciation, fueled by a Marxist intolerance for dissent that now makes its belated cousin, cancel culture, seem quaint. Today, we'll take a deep look at one of Kundera's Czech-language novels, 1979's truly incredible work, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. And if we keep our wits about us, we may be able to use some of what we conjure here to help prefigure what would become his most popular work, 1984's instant classic, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. First, a little background. Ludwig Kundera, the author's father, was a pianist and musicologist who immersed himself in the works of Liszt, Bach, and Schumann, among many others, performing widely and teaching at Brno Conservatory until 1941, when he was removed from his position by the occupying Nazi forces. It's no surprise that an author of such well-formed and musical prose as Kundera should have had a professional pianist as a father. Indeed, music would go on to figure strongly in Kundera's writing, and in The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, Bach's fugues become a metaphor for the churning babble of languages and cultures in the Soviet sphere, which Moscow strives catastrophically and unsuccessfully to bind together into a coherent music, the way Johann Sebastian Bach was able to do with his fugues. This book is a novel in the form of variations. The tradition of music, crucially, is the great bearer of cultural memory. It is music with memory, encoded influence, evolution, the etudes, the sketches, the symphonies, and what Kundera suggests was finally Beethoven's most deeply cherished form, the variations on the theme. What are variations, after all, but a great dialogue with the past, an engagement in history, and renewal of the bonds of memory, and finally, a set of missives from a deeper past into posterity. Naturally, the key source material for Kundera's wondrous and wry prose is the fact he has lived through it all, seen it all up close. Let's hear an excerpt from the Book of Laughter and Forgetting that throws this world history into relief. Since there is not a single historic event we can count on being commonly known, I must speak of events that took place a few years ago, as if they were 1,000 years old. In 1939, the German army entered Bohemia, and the Czech state ceased to exist. In 1945, the Russian army entered Bohemia, and the country once again was called an independent republic. The people were enthusiastic about the Russia that had driven out the Germans, and seeing in the Czech Communist Party its faithful arm, they became sympathetic to it. So the Communists took power in February 1948 with neither bloodshed nor violence, but greeted by the cheers of about half the nation. And now, please note, the half that did the cheering was the more dynamic, the more intelligent, the better. Anyway, Kundera was given to stating things plainly, which requires a fair amount of sophistication. And when dealing with totalitarian issues, a kind of invisible, vast, Chaucerian level of irony to pull it off. And in no time, he had his Czech citizenship revoked. But no matter, he was living in exile in France by that point anyway, so it goes. We're all familiar with this kind of story, that is, if we haven't forgotten it by now. And forgetting, after all, is Kundera's great subject. What does this all mean for our current predicament? Well, we'll come to that a bit later, with a detour into Niall Ferguson's important article, The Treason of the Intellectuals. But first, let's button up a bit more of 20th century Czech history so we can properly accommodate Kundera's novels into our understanding, and then work to demonstrate what has been lost or forgotten in the imagination and thus in the souls of popular readership, such as it is in a post-Kundera world. Let's fast forward 20 years from that important year, 1948, to another barn burner of a year, 1968. In France, students overturned cars. In England, the Beatles released the White Album and Magical Mystery Tour. And in Czechoslovakia, they enjoyed temporarily an 8-month period of liberalization and reform known as the Prague Spring. During the Prague Spring, Kundera was 39 years old and had already published his first novel, The Joke, in 1967. It was a book that would set up the thematic underpinnings for really all of his novels, the comic and cosmic distance between one man's subjective reality, his experience of life and romance, and the rather humorless, continually deadening atmosphere of communist totalitarianism, of the kind of neighbor-denouncing pathologies which simultaneously produce both deep paranoia as well as callousness, the kind which was described in nonfiction form absolutely magisterially by Nobel Prize-winning Belarusian author Svetlana Alexievich in her unflinching masterpiece, Secondhand Time. Well, in August of 1968, the Soviet army, joined by Warsaw Pact forces in a contingent of some 600,000 strong, broke up the party, if you'll forgive the expression, and the Prague Spring came to an end. After the Soviets came in, Kundera was blacklisted, and The Joke, along with all his subsequent books, enjoyed being banned in his home country. This is, in many ways, a mark of honor, to be sure, but really, let's face it, it was a total pain in the ass. This was the same political moment which shaped an entire generation of Czech writers and thinkers, including playwright Václav Havel, who would go on, 20 years later, to lead the Velvet Revolution of 1989, which successfully and peacefully toppled the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. Havel had spent roughly 4 years imprisoned during the early 1980s, during which time he wrote the epistles to his beloved wife, which would later be gathered together in an immensely moving and popular collection, Letters to Olga, which serves as a testament not only to the brutality of the Soviet system, but to the power of the endurance and resilience of a single man in the face of such inhumane brutality. Václav Havel's name should be uttered in the same breath as that of other important atlases of world history, including Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Alexei Navalny. It should be noted that our much-beloved author, Sir Salman Rushdie, carried Letters to Olga with him throughout his many years in hiding following the fatwa issued against him on Valentine's Day in 1989. In any event, later that year, in November of 1989, our erstwhile playwright Václav Havel would become the final president of Czechoslovakia, and subsequently, after that state dissolved in 1992, he would become the first president of the newly formed Czech Republic. So, we've cooked up quite a storm here. Now to Kundera's inimitable style. Kundera is a master of the pastiche. He brings together eroticism, dreams, geopolitical analysis, history, counterfactual, personal narrative, and the absurd. His use of the absurd, however, is a scenic rather than a structural one. Elements of absurdism and magic realism may combine in his pages to create moments that accentuate our understanding of an absurd condition, an absurd mentality, of a kind of contagious misunderstanding between parent and grown child, between lovers, husbands and wives and mistresses, friends, between classmates, between boss and worker, mechanic and horoscope writer, teacher and student. And suddenly, Milan Kundera appears directly and at first fleetingly in the narrative as the narrator, recounting and recontextualizing life under Soviet-Russian perpetual impingement, writing an astrology column on the sly as he'd been removed from his official position since, well, weren't they all eventually all men with a little history under their belts, all men and women of a certain age, all men with a name to speak of? All of these had to go in time. In Kundera's conception and portrayal of Prague, it's not so much that the personal is political, as in Karel Hannisch's phrasing, relevant to the time, but that bipolar geopolitics has become the leitmotif for a series of ongoing romances continually interrupted and defiled by the strongman's thugs, who themselves will be cleared out in time. But all the while, there's that sneaking suspicion that, as Kundera puts it so pertly and perfectly as the title for one of his early novels, that life is elsewhere. Metaphysics might not be the only way of understanding politics, but it's the only way of understanding broken romances, which is the only way of getting to the lonely existentialism at the heart of Kundera's works. He provides us a symposium on the apparent similarities and the utter differences between the laughter of the angels and the laughter of the devils. But ultimately, it's the laughter that arrives when the joke is on you that rings the loudest and the longest. That's the laughter worth savoring, for it is authentic, and it will survive when all else has been displaced, dislocated, and forgotten. Like Salman Rushdie, Dante, and, I guess, Dan Brown, Kundera wades in where angels fear to tread. To see the devil as a partisan of evil and an angel as a warrior on the side of good is to accept the demagogy of the angels. Things are, of course, more complicated than that. Angels are partisans not of the good, but of divine creation. The devil, on the other hand, is the one who refuses to grant any rational meaning to that divinely created world. The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, in a bleak, refracted, but necessary way, charts the path for how Milan Kundera, or more precisely for how some representative version of Milan Kundera, came to recognize that he must leave his beloved country, that as a marked man, a writer, he'd become toxic, socially and professionally, by maintaining any proximity to those he loved. I, too, once danced in a ring, It was in 1948. In my country, the communists had taken power, the socialist and democratic Christian ministers had taken refuge abroad, and I took other communist students by the hands or shoulders, and we took 2 steps in place, 1 step forward, raised the left leg to one side and then the right to the other, and we did this nearly every month because we always had something to celebrate, an anniversary or some other event. Old injustices were redressed. New injustices were perpetrated. Factories were nationalized. Thousands of people went to prison. Medical care was free. Tobacconists saw their shops confiscated. Aged workers vacationed for the first time in expropriated villas. And on our faces we had the smile of happiness. Then one day I said something I should not have said, was expelled from the party, and had to leave the ring dance. That is when I understood the magical meaning of the circle. If you go away from a row, you can still come back into it. A row is an open formation, but a circle closes up, and if you go away from it, there is no way back. It is not by chance that the planets move in circles, and that a rock coming loose from one of them goes inexorably away, carried off by centrifugal force. Like a meteorite broken off from a planet, I left the circle, and have not yet stopped falling. For writing this novel, Kundera's Czech citizenship will be revoked. His next novel will be called The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and its great themes have been worked through and developed in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting. Both books maintain the author's preoccupations with the effect on individual lives, hearts, minds, loves, and personal history of mass cultural forgetting. From the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, prefiguring his next book, that hollowness in her stomach is exactly that unbearable absence of weight. And just as an extreme can at any moment turn into its opposite, so lightness brought to its maximum becomes the terrifying weight of lightness, and Tamina knows she cannot bear it for another moment. If Kundera was already an important literary figure, The Unbearable Lightness of Being will make him truly famous. Women and men. His women are beautiful or ugly, or plain country girls with their own heightened reality. They are friends or mothers or married women or teachers or asylum seekers who pour cognac and coffee in small western cities. They, like Tamina, his central character, are introduced on a single plane of characterization at first, until a trigger in the plot, usually some ironic device such as a non-reader friend who wishes to be introduced to an author, precipitates an exploration of her inwardness. And before long, an entire cosmology of inwardness opens before the reader. This is also true for men, though men are generally cast either as experienced or inexperienced lovers, scientists or poets, perpetrators or failures, or great successes who then become the subject or object of some cosmic joke. Men and women in Kundera's novels interact at peace or in sexual violence as a coping mechanism or as a last-ditch effort to render their humanity visible to themselves. Is his work erotic? Yes, of course it is, but I won't go excerpting the whole book for you, so get a hold of yourself. For he was aware of the great secret of life. Women don't look for handsome men. Women look for men who have had beautiful women. I'm not asseverating before you, dear reader, that this is in any sense true, just as I am not claiming it is false. What I'm saying is that with Milan Kundera, this is what you get. You can take it or leave it, and for my part, I'll take it. Hand in hand with philosophical rumination and a political lodestar is a sexual and interpersonal dynamic and ultimately a faith claim. He's won me over for more than 20 years at this point, and that's separate from claiming his ideas are true. The conditions of his drama, however, which he sets with a tuning fork, are nothing short of tragicomic perfection. Some 230 pages into the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, Kundera provides an abstract, or a thesis statement for his great work. This book is a novel in the form of variations. The various parts follow each other like the various stages of a voyage leading into the interior of a theme, the interior of a thought, the interior of a single unique situation, the understanding of which recedes from my sight into the distance. It is a novel about Tamina, and whenever Tamina goes off stage, it is a novel for Tamina. She is its principal character and its principal audience. What might you need to know about Tamina? Nothing to start. She is tall and beautiful, but don't hold it against her. She has lost her husband, and her emotional world remains in a state of arrested development, her love letters locked in a desk in faraway Prague, while she, a political refugee, works as a barista in a small, unnamed city in Western Europe. She's forgetting the details of her husband's face, his hands, his tenderness, and she fears allowing her personal letters to fall into the hands of the Czechoslovakian police, who scour such documents in search of political vulnerabilities. That would amount to an erasure of her identity, an abduction and co-option of her deepest selfhood. Kundera the character, who, like Chaucer the Pilgrim, increasingly appears in his own narrative, movingly recounts his last days with his dying father. During this time, he describes a radio address the two of them had heard together, given by Czechoslovakian President Gustav Husak. The president was addressing the children of Czechoslovakia in one of his usual propagandistic rhapsodies. "Children," Husak says, "you are the future." And now I realize, Kundera intercedes, I realize these words have a meaning that was not initially apparent. Children are the future not because they will one day be adults, but because humanity is becoming more and more a child, because childhood is the image of the future. He shouted, "Children never look back!" And this meant that we must never allow the future to be weighed down by memory. Pick your issue, whether it's literacy or environmentalism, social justice or inflation, cancel culture or gender equality, or the Israel-Hamas war. What do we stand to lose in these conversations if we give up on our cultural memory, if we give way to what Australian expat writer Clive James memorably called cultural amnesia? Returning from our earlier Niall Ferguson detour, let's briefly revisit a key passage from his December 2023 article, The Treason of the Intellectuals, for the Free Press. As the great German sociologist Max Weber rightly argued in his 1917 essay on Science as a Vocation, political activism should not be permissible in a lecture hall because, quote, the prophet and the demagogue do not belong on the academic platform. In other words, looping it back to our present conversation, Marxism benefits from cleared memory banks, and therefore, in practice, it works to instantiate cultural forgetting, be that to denounce political opponents, or exiling writers, or cropping people out of photos, as also happens in Kundera's novel. Marxism, be it political or cultural, puts its onus on the untold revolutionary tomorrow. And when it sweeps into university culture, universities which grew in part out of European monastery culture and which ought to be a bastion of remembering and contemplation, think of Hermann Hesse's incredible novel, The Glass Bead Game, for a powerful referent here. As soon as Marxists sweep into a university culture, it's not long before that university culture is doomed. British historian Arnold J. Toynbee famously characterized history as one damned thing after another. Marxism yearns for an eradication of the past, in particular to traditions, be they social, ethical, religious, or otherwise, in order to attempt a sustained revolution of the proletariat, or working class, in the current moment, always verging on a new horizon, never succumbing to the blandishments of nostalgia, homesickness, or received wisdom. Let us return to our opening gambit. One morning, and it will be soon, when everyone wakes up as a writer, the age of universal deafness and incomprehension will have arrived. If we encounter Kundera today, it is likely in the context of a collapsed public literacy. Some will push back on this idea and claim that public literacy is robust. Others will shake their head ruefully and know precisely what I'm describing. Literary critic Harold Bloom, whom I had the pleasure of lunching with at his home in New Haven before he passed, often described a solitary archipelago of deep readers cast around the globe. Not precisely in community, but in a kind of cohort of practice and understanding, literacy. The ability to read and write. There's a difference we might acknowledge, not merely in others, but in ourselves. Let me put it somewhat hyperbolically in order to make the point. When we think about literacy, which may be defined as the ability to read and write, there are, as Kendrick Lamar once pointed out, levels to it. Being able to write one's name, to read the back of a cereal box, or to jog through and accept the terms and conditions on TikTok, while important milestones in reading and writing, these dilute our statistical understanding of what it means to be literate. At Times Arrow, we're passionate about fostering the conditions for what I'd like to call deep literacy, which might be thought of as the capacity to sit with a sophisticated text and not only to absorb the narrative, its details, and its core themes, but to bring oneself into the engagement, to reflect back and free associate while reading a text so that book and reader come into a kind of dynamic unity. As we conclude our time together, let's divert ourselves briefly to the poem which, for me, best encapsulates the ideal of deep literacy. The House Was Quiet and the World Was Calm by American poet Wallace Stevens. The house was quiet and the world was calm. The reader became the book, and summer night was like the conscious being of the book. The house was quiet and the world was calm. The words were spoken as if there was no book, except that the reader leaned above the page, wanted to lean, wanted much most to be the scholar to whom his book is true, to whom the summer night is like a perfection of thought. The house was quiet because it had to be. The quiet was part of the meaning, part of the mind, the access of perfection to the page, and the world was calm. The truth in a calm world in which there is no other meaning, itself is calm, itself is summer and night, itself is the reader leaning late and reading there. That is the algorithm we should prefer, the one in which when we authentically encounter a gripping tale or poem or account well told, our human history and supra-personal memory begins to free associate, to connect, to reveal our deepest selves to ourself. This is a self-portrait, as John Ashbery might have said, and did, in a convex mirror. It is a conception of literature and history that is helpful and grounding when approaching the great novels of Milan Kundera and his peers the world over, including Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, Italo Calvino, Edna O'Brien, and so many others. Information is endlessly available to us. Where shall wisdom be found? As readers, as people, we want it all. And there's nothing innately wrong with that. But as we mature, as poet J. Parini says, we begin to practice the art of subtraction. The books need to bang, or we're going to look elsewhere. And Milan Kundera, he had it all. He was the total package. He wrote books that were about the dislocations of our time, about people and loss and reason and evil. And the eroticism wasn't stuck on with duct tape and glue. It was endemic to the work. It was high romance and philosophy and a rueful look at human evil and the laughter of angels. We should continue as readers to demand books that can deliver, and we should demand of ourselves that we take time to throw the phone on airplane mode and go buy and read those books. Let's make 2024 a year of doing it better. What are you waiting for? Thanks for watching. If this sort of literary material appeals to you, I want to make one request. Please consider sharing it with another person who you think would also like it. And if you're really feeling generous, please hit the subscribe button. You know the drill. Finally, we've been building a reading platform online. It's an exploratory timeline of world literature where you can discover great works from ages past, annotate them, and choose your own adventure through reading history. We'd love it if you would consider subscribing. We try to keep the price as low as possible, but if it's something you feel like you can't afford, just drop me a line at info@timesarrow.org and I'll set you up with a free account for 1 year. Good luck out there. These books aren't going to read themselves.